Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and our Moving Beyond Earth exhibit. I'm Jennifer Levasseur, a curator here at the museum, and I want to welcome you to our program. I'm also the curator for our brand new exhibit called Outside the Spacecraft, which we'll go tour afterwards if you want to join me. And first, we're going to show you a little video about the gallery. We are in Outside the Spacecraft, 50 Years of Extra-Vehicular Activity. This is an exhibition being staged here at the museum in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the first spacewalks. Right now, we're in the middle of installing objects in preparation for our opening.
It's very inspiring to work on a project like this, to come down here and to see someone looking at something that interests them and excites them is very rewarding.
Space is a very dangerous place, and so to leave the spacecraft, to live and to work outside of it, we need what we call a personal spacecraft. That's the spacesuit.
This is the spacesuit display for Gene Cernan spacesuit from his EVA activity in Gemini 9, and it's really fragile, so we really didn't think we could actually display this spacesuit at any point in its lifetime here at the museum until we came up with this system to support the suit at the top, which relieves pressure from the heavy section of the suit and then supports the suit across the entire body. And what we're looking at is the interior suit of Gemini 9, Cernan's space EVA flight with his cover layer next to it, it's kind of like an exploded view of the two suits together. We couldn't marry them back together. They had to be displayed separately. The object behind me is the umbilical cord that attached Ed White to a spacecraft during his Gemini 4 flight and kept him from floating away in space. It has a gold coating on the outside, which is really fragile. And over time, it's been left coiled, so we've displayed it that way to preserve the object so our visitors can see it on display. This object is being displayed by our museum for the very first time. It is the cover to the backpack that Gene Cernan wore on the moon, which had his life support system in it. And it was returned from the lunar surface with him during his mission in 1972. And NASA looked at the cover, examined it. We found out that they documented it and packaged it, where it remained sealed since 1973, 20 days after his mission. It was given to our museum and was kept in storage, preserved, and we opened it to display it for the very first time during this show. These boots before us were the last boots to walk on the moon. They were Gene Cernan's Apollo 17 EVA boots, which would go over the boot of his spacesuit and left footprints on the lunar surface. These have been displayed in our museum several times in other galleries, but we haven't shown them in this orientation. We thought it was important to show the actual boot that made the footprints on the moon.
The last section of the exhibit is on tools, and tools can range anything from very basic tools that you might use here on Earth to things that are highly specialized for the space environment. So we have cameras, timekeeping devices, checklists, special cameras, and foot restraints. One of our most spectacular objects in the exhibit is what's called manipulator foot restraint from the last of the Hubble servicing missions, STS-125. As I was doing my work as a curator and visually confirming that the object had indeed flown on STS-125, our curator worked with NASA and found through their paperwork that not only had it flown on STS-125, it had also flown previous missions as well. The glove exhibit we're installing is really a centerpiece, quite literally, of the entire gallery. It sits in the center of the gallery and is a pretty extraordinary looking feature. We do have some historic gloves in the display itself. One of the most important is Kathy Sullivan's glove from her EVA as the first U.S. woman to do an EVA during the shuttle program. There's another thread in the exhibit, and that's about art and photography. And so I wanted to select artwork from our collection that really demonstrates how artists have interpreted the experience of astronauts on EVA. And the photographs, including the one here at the entrance to the gallery, are really evocative of that experience.
I really wanted to inspire the next generation. So there's a lot of big scenes in the gallery.
We can't go there ourselves, but the visuals are really what bring that home for all of us. All right, well, let's go back 50 years. What was happening 50 years ago was a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was a competition to be the first at things. And in this case, EVA, extravehicular activity, or spacewalking. So in March of 1965, Alexei Leonov, a Soviet cosmonaut, exited his spacecraft for the first time and made that first spacewalk. And a few months later, Ed White on Gemini 4 made his first spacewalk, first American spacewalk. And so to leave the spacecraft takes some very important things, but you have to be able to carry something with you. You have to carry your own environment when you leave the spacecraft. And so to have that environment with you, you need a very special tool, which is a spacesuit. Inside that spacesuit, you need to have a few things that keep you alive. The things that keep you alive on Earth, you have to take them with you. And in the case of the early astronauts, they had to have something that connected them to the spacecraft, an umbilical cord that provided them with oxygen. It provided them with their any electricity they needed in their spacecraft or in the spacesuit. They needed to have pressure. You have pressure weighing down on you on Earth's surface, and so you have to take that with you. And they needed to have a tether, something that could hold them to the spacecraft. And so when we go to the next slide here, you'll see just what that looked like on the very first spacewalk for Ed White. You can see that gold umbilical. So that's carrying all of the things that he needs. It's carrying it from the spacecraft to his spacesuit. And you could see that it was carried inside that little green bag there. And so as he left the spacecraft, that umbilical would go out farther and farther. Next slide. And here you see that umbilical, the gold-coated umbilical in our exhibit. That gold coating would protect the umbilical cord from radiation. And when we go up to the exhibit later, you'll get a chance to see this. Next slide. So after Ed White on Gemini 4, there are a number of different spacewalks during the Gemini program in the mid-1960s. This is a photograph of Gene Cernan's spacewalk on Gemini 9. Now, Gene Cernan was going to do quite a bit of activity, but when he got outside, he found out it was really, really difficult to maneuver himself around outside the spacecraft. He actually got overworked. His spacesuit visor fogged up, kind of like if you're outside and you go in between a hot and a cold place, your glasses can fog up. That's what happened to him, and he got really overworked. He got very sweaty, and he found out that he really didn't have the right kind of equipment inside his spacesuit to control his temperature. And so on later missions, astronauts would wear what's called a liquid cooling garment to control their body temperature while they were inside their spacesuits. You can also see the umbilical cord that he's using in this picture, that white line kind of through the middle. The umbilical cord was coated in beta cloth, which would protect it from abrasions. And so you could be outside the spacecraft and not have to worry too much about having anything damaged inside that umbilical. So Cernan got very overworked, and after Cernan's mission, astronauts started training in new and different ways for their EVA work. Next slide. So here you see astronaut Michael Collins training for his Gemini 10 EVA. He's inside an airplane that would go up into the atmosphere and do these large parabolas to give him some sense of weightlessness as he came back down. And you can see he's training in a spacesuit. He's got an umbilical attached to the side of the airplane. He also, and many of the astronauts at this time also started training underwater, and so they're having to do the same thing where they have some kind of a cord attached to themselves to be able to bring them all their needs inside their spacesuit. And here he's also got a very large chest pack, which helps him have additional control over the conditions inside his spacesuit. And here you can see he's actually working on something that looks a bit like the outside of the spacecraft, so that when he would go up into space, he would have a little bit easier time. But unfortunately, things still weren't perfect. Michael Collins had quite a bit of difficulty on his EVA on Gemini 10, and his lasted actually under an hour. On the next slide, you'll see another astronaut, Richard Gordon, on Gemini 11. He had so much trouble on his EVA, he actually used his legs to help keep him close to the spacecraft. And his EVA lasted about half an hour. So EVAs aren't lasting any longer, and they still hadn't quite perfected a system for keeping all of these needs of your body working in unison so that you could be outside the spacecraft and work for long periods of time. Next slide. And on the last of the Gemini missions, Buzz Aldrin went out and did an EVA. His lasted for about 2 hours. And he had a little bit easier of a time. He had more handholds to keep him close to the spacecraft, but generally the system was about the same. He did quite a bit of underwater training for his EVA. He was very well prepared, but still there wasn't an ability with the umbilical cord to really move past the spacecraft and do a lot of exploring. So on the next slide, you're going to see what the solution was for the Apollo program. This is Rusty Schweickart during Apollo 9. Early in 1969, he tested the very first backpack-style support system. You can see it on his back there. The part sort of between his shoulders and his waist, that's the main backpack. That would carry all of the things he needed with him. So now he could go away from the spacecraft like we would need to do on the moon and carry all of his life support system with him. This is called the personal life support system. It also has a backup system, which is the section on the top of the backpack. That's the emergency system called the Oxygen Purge System. And we'll hear Lisa talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So Schweikert tests the first backpack in space, and that went on to be used by all of the astronauts who explored the moon. Next slide. But there were some special EVAs during the Apollo program as well that didn't involve walking on the moon. They actually went back to an umbilical system for some of the EVAs done in deep space. This is Al Worden on Apollo 15. He had to exit the spacecraft in that time between the moon and coming back to Earth to go back into the spacecraft and retrieve some film canisters. And so he was attached by an umbilical cord again, went back to the backside of the spacecraft. But in his case, and in the case of the other two astronauts who did that during Apollo, they had backpacks as a backup system. So that was another thing that was available to them. But for future astronauts, things changed back to that backpack. Next slide. So during the shuttle program and, of course, on the space station, astronauts do use a backpack system, a primary life support system. Here you can see on STS-125, one of the Hubble servicing missions. This is Drew Feustel using a backpack. And to really be able to explore, to continue to explore and go beyond back to other places like Mars and go back to the moon or to asteroids, astronauts need to have a very simple system that's able to, that doesn't tie them down to a spacecraft, to be able to walk around, look at things, and have that environment inside their spacesuit kind of going along with them. And so next, we're going to be hearing from our objects conservator, Lisa Young. But first, we'll see a little video that talks about something special she did for our Outside the Spacecraft exhibit. The really cool thing we're here to do at the museum today is to open a package of one of the last things to return from the moon in 1972. The package was closed up and hasn't been exposed to the air ever since.
The object we're looking at today came from the Apollo 17 mission, worn by Gene Cernan, who was the last astronaut to ever walk on the moon.
Really cool. Wow.
So it was the outer covering that would have gone on his life support system at the top part of his backpack, and it would have been exposed to all the elements on the lunar surface.
The Apollo 17 mission was significant because it was the last time humans have traveled to the moon and back. They traveled quite a few kilometers on their lunar rovers. They did an incredible amount of scientific work because Harrison Schmitt, who was the other astronaut, was the only geologist, the only scientist to ever go to the moon. So the intensity of their workload was very high. They were literally covered from head to foot in lunar dust.
We wanted to look at it with experts in the lab today so we could determine if the object still had original lunar dust on it, if NASA had cleaned the object after it had been returned from the lunar surface, or it had been packaged and opened and we thought it had just been left in a packaging. I really expected it to be a little bit more dirty and have more lunar dust in sort of the folds and the pockets, which does lead me to believe that NASA serviced it before they packaged it.
Yeah. So when we opened up the package today, what was really cool about seeing this thing for the first time, unfolded and exposed, was really just how scuffed up it looked. It looked like it had really been used quite a bit. But what I couldn't tell until we got it under the microscope is just how much lunar dust got embedded into the fibers. It was amazing. It's just covered. And to the naked eye, you can't see any of that really. So it looks just used, and clearly there are some cuts and abrasions on it. But what's really great is when you get up close to it and you get the microscope on it, it's so clear how that dust just kind of gets sucked into that material and embedded underneath the fibers really.
And then these little grains that you see, the little spots, are all the more angular pieces of the lunar dust. The flags that were put onto the life support system cover were painted. So seeing the paint on the surfaces of the fabrics is really interesting to me because we were able to tell how they were applied, if they're actually flaking out themselves off the surfaces, and then how the lunar dust sort of embeds itself between the paint layers of the surface and the actual fabric itself. the astronauts were asked to take all the extraneous items off. They left their life support systems up there because they were very heavy. And even though this is small and very insignificant in weight-wise, it was part of the life support system, so he must have removed the cover and then decided to take it with him. All these extras that we have from Apollo 17, including his lunar boots, which will also be on display, are the only evidence that we have from that last mission, and we don't have those from earlier missions.
We often experience really unique moments with our artifacts, and so to be present when one this unique and this special is opened for the first time, to see a package that was sealed in 1973 before I was even born, opened and exposed to the air, and get to look at it under a microscope is incredibly special.
Hi, my name is Lisa Young, and I am an objects conservator at the National Air and Space Museum. And my job is to work in mostly a laboratory setting where I look at materials that objects are made of, look at the age of the materials, how something's made, work with the curator to determine the history of an object, and then to keep the object from deteriorating over time or decaying. So if you think of things that you might have that you've left outside, or that you have in your own collection at home, a special toy, a special pair of shoes, every time you wear them, you're creating wear and use to those materials, and we're trying to stop that from continuing with our objects. So usually I work in a really quiet environment, but we agreed to have our opening of the OPS cover filmed and videotaped so we could share it with you all today and put it in the exhibit. We really didn't know what we would find when we opened it, so as Jennifer pointed out and the video shows, we really needed to focus on our work, so we had everybody else take the pictures for us. But one of the most important jobs that a conservator does is document. And we have to document everything we do to objects, every time we touch an object, and anytime we handle it in the laboratory. Next slide. We use specialized equipment to look at the materials up close, and this is our 3D microscope. It's a digital microscope system we have in our conservation laboratory at the Air and Space Museum, which is actually at the Udvar Hazy Center. And here we're looking at the cover right after we took it out of the package, which is where I got some of those really close-up shots of the materials that we're going to look at. Next slide. So you can see by the cover it is scuffed up. It was definitely worn and used and packaged by NASA when it came back from the lunar surface mission. We're not sure how much work they actually did to the cover before they packaged it, but we did note that there weren't a lot of loose dirt in the crevices or in the folds, so we know that they did clean it. But you can see by the instructional tags on the outside of the OPS cover that they are scuffed and they're abraded, and you can see all that lunar dust, the gray dust in the Velcro, which is really interesting. Next slide. So lunar dust is really abrasive, and it cuts into the materials on the outside of a spacesuit or the same materials that this OPS cover is made of. And you can see on the surfaces when you look at it under magnification that it's still embedded in all the fibers of that material. And that's called beta cloth. And the outside of all the spacesuits from the Apollo time period forward is known, it's called beta cloth, this material. It's a fiberglass material that's coated with a Teflon coating. And it was really, really tough and was meant to keep meteorites out of the spacesuits or keep the suit from being punctured when it was being worn in space. But this lunar dust is so abrasive that it embeds itself between the little fibers on the textile. So the spacesuits are made of about 21 to 24 different materials, and a lot of those materials we can't see. So even though we can see the exterior material, the beta cloth that I just showed you, we cannot see any of these interior materials without looking through an X-ray machine or a CAT scan machine, which we do with some of our spacesuits. But the OPS cover would have had many of these materials inside because they're used to insulate that garment when it's on the lunar surface from radiation and thermal temperature changes. So we have things like that you might be familiar with are Velcro, nylon, Dacron, Mylar, and some other interesting materials that were made for the space age. Next slide. So even though we see damage to the object, this is actually damage through use. So you would not want to actually remove this damage or to repair it without much documentation and thought, because it actually gives you interesting information about how the object was used on the lunar surface. And these commander stripes, which represented Gene Cernan as the commander of that mission, were applied to his suit so when people looked at the lunar surface during Apollo 17, you would see one person that had red stripes on their spacesuit and one person that did not, and you could tell them on television. So the commander stripes are made out of a plastic material that's sewn to the outside of the textile, and it got abraded on the surface. And we see this abrasion a lot on the back of the spacesuit, and in this particular case, the cover, where they sat in the lunar rover, and the back of their portable life support system was rubbing up against the seat. So because that sort of tells a story and it's information that's with the object, we want to try to keep that information with the object as long as possible. We do not want to repair it or take it away from the object. So that's the kind of damage that we're used to seeing on space items. It's all due to them actually using the object during its operation, and we expect that. Next slide. But what we didn't expect to see on this object, which is interesting, are these repairs that were made. And we found several repairs on the OPS cover. And on top of the repairs were this opaque white silicone coating that somebody painted on the repair. The beta cloth, like I said to you, was fiberglass. So the fiberglass fibers are always breaking and often are fragmented when they come back from the lunar surface and we look at the objects. So it's not uncommon that we would see fragmented fibers that may need to be fixed. But on other suits in our collection, we've also seen repairs similar in nature to this, just not with the same sort of coating. And we don't have an answer right now as to who coated the repair or when it was done. Did he do it in the LEM? Did he do it in the capsule when they were bringing back the OPS cover? Or did NASA do it to service the item when it was returned to Earth? So we are still looking into that, and it's something we need to research more fully after the exhibit's taken down in June. Next slide. We also saw these hand-stitched threads across one of the repairs through the coating. So I'm still not sure as well who would have stitched the materials back together. They're definitely not a material that you would use in manufacturing the OPS cover. Everything was machine stitched. And they had very tight white little threads. So we still need to look into this repair as soon as it comes off display. Next slide. So this is a close-up picture of the paints on the surface of the beta cloth. So you can see the shiny material here where you can see that it's actually a glass fiber. And the paints are sort of wearing away off that surface. This is actually part of his name tag. And if you noticed when we showed one of the first slides, the name tag was painted or printed in red. Most of the printed name tags on any of the spacesuits or covers are black. But Gene Cernan's was red. And I still do not have an answer as to why that happened either. But you can see the paints on the surface. So this is something where we would just try to monitor the object and to keep track of its condition and to make sure that that's not worsening over time. Next slide. This is another shot of the star, and I just wanted to point out carefully that even though you can't see, when you see the object upstairs on display, you're not going to be able to see the lunar dust in the star itself. The star is an unpainted portion of the flag that was applied with the original fabric showing through. And under magnification, you can see the lunar dust embedded in those tiny fibers. But to the naked eye, you don't see that. So that's why we need to look at everything really, really closely in the laboratory. We don't want to do anything to the object or unnecessarily clean the surface of an object if we're not sure that it does have lunar dust on it. And all these interesting repairs that I mentioned and features of the object are all information that we're going to archive with our object at the museum for future research and for people to learn about. This is not stuff that was written in the history books. So if somebody were to ask me what my coolest part of my job is, which I often get, it's that we're adding information to history, that the history is coming alive and we're recording things about our objects that no one's ever seen before. Especially in this case, this object's been wrapped up for 40 years, and we're adding information to that history of those lunar missions. Next slide. And just to wrap up quickly, this is the object after conservation. It doesn't look much different than it did when I unwrapped it, but I have documented, analyzed it, and stabilized it for display, and we're going to see this up in the gallery when we go up for our tour afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Now I want to introduce Dr. Gregory Quinn. He is a research engineer at UTC Aerospace Systems. Gregory.
Jennifer. My job at UTC Aerospace Systems is to research new technologies for spacesuits and spacecraft. And we, at the company, we invented the backpack for the Apollo spacesuit, as well as the one for the spacesuit that flew on shuttle and is up on the space station right now. This afternoon I'm going to tell you a little bit about what a spacesuit has to do for the astronaut in a little more detail, and then go into what's being done for the next generation of spacesuits, some of the challenges that we face in getting people beyond low Earth orbit and how we're meeting them. The basic life support functions, as were mentioned earlier, is to provide oxygen for the crew member to breathe, provide pressure on the body. Right now we're at 14.7 pounds per square inch of air pressure. You need at least 2 to survive, and most spacesuits operate at around 4 or 5 pounds per square inch, so that has to be provided. We have to remove the gases that everyone exhales. Most of that is carbon dioxide, and it's a closed circulation loop, so it would go into the suit and come back around into the helmet again if we didn't get rid of it. We need to provide the right temperature for the crew members, for the astronauts. It can be very, very cold in space, down to minus 250 degrees, or as much as 250 degrees in the sun and in hot locations. So they need to work in those environments that could change within minutes of each other, and the suits need to protect them from that. We also provide communications to the astronauts. You can't just talk through your helmet bubble to the person next to you because there's no air to carry your voice from person to person. And finally, emergency provisions. If there's a tear in the suit, if the fan stops working, if the pump stops working, the Oxygen Purge System or the secondary oxygen pack provide emergency functions to the suit for about 30 minutes so that the astronauts can get safely back into their vehicles. Next slide, please. Now, we've provided these functions to the Gemini astronauts, the Apollo astronauts, shuttle, and the space station. But going further will require a new generation of suit that's more self-reliant, lighter weight, and more reliable than the past suits have been, as amazing as those have been. I liken it to the space station to being at a hotel. You drive up to the hotel, you can take your huge bags with you, you put them in your room, you can go out and get dinner and come back, you can have family members come and supply you with fresh clothes if you run out. Similar, the space station gets resupplies regularly from the Earth, and they have a lot of room to store spare parts and everything they need, the provisions. Going to the moon was more difficult. They had about a 3-day return. They were going to be there doing up to 3 moonwalks for each mission. And they had to take everything with them and take everything back that they could. It's a lot like backpacking. You might be on the trail, and it might take you a day to get off the trail if something goes wrong. And if something goes wrong with your equipment, your backpack, your boots, you had to deal with it for a short amount of time. Going as far as Mars, though, is a whole other story. The astronauts that go to Mars eventually, or back to the moon for a moon base, will be out there for possibly years at a time without reliable resupply. They'll have to be able to service their equipment, including their spacesuits, with only what they have on hand. So it's more akin to being at something like an Arctic research station, where weather and other events can have them snowed in for months and months on end. So the spacesuits, even though they're supplying the same functions to the astronauts, they have to be built to be serviced, built to be reliable, and built to last a lot longer. The components on the Apollo suits only had to last 3 walks, and some of them were getting pretty beat up by the end of those moonwalks. That can't happen on Mars when they need to be used possibly for 100 times. So that's one of the challenges that NASA and engineers will have to solve to get us past low Earth orbit. Next slide. Fortunately, work has already begun on this. And this, to me, is exciting work. It's work that I've participated in with NASA and the community. And one of the efforts has been on the life support system. Back about 4 years ago in 2011, NASA put together a functional system. So they had all the different parts of the portable life support system spread over lots of different racks in the lab. And you can see the picture on the left there is fairly big. It doesn't look anything like a backpack, but it did all of those functions that I talked about earlier. Just last year, they finished building and started testing the next version of that had upgraded components and incorporated the lessons that they learned on that previous system. And they packaged it down to something about the size of a backpack today. That one is still under test, but one of the things that's been exciting about that is test subjects have actually breathed on it. Not down at low pressures or with pure oxygen, but room-type gases, but they have been breathing on it and getting test data from subjects that way. The next version is already being built. It probably won't be ready for at least around 2 or 3 years, but it will be a functional prototype in the end that they'll be putting in vacuum chambers, so they pump out all the gases in the room, and the crew member will be breathing on that unit. And that's the last step necessary before a production unit is made and people fly with it in space again. So these new items are addressing the technology needs for getting us back outside the spacecraft in the future. Next slide. One of the other interesting challenges that I face as an engineer, NASA faces, is affordability. NASA's been addressing this in quite a unique way, and there's some exhibits here in this gallery, in fact, that point to it, where they're looking to commercialize travel up to orbit, to the space station, where they're paying companies like SpaceX and Orbital Sciences to ship crew and cargo up to the station. They pay them for the services, and they get their astronauts and resupplies that way. What that lets NASA do is focus their energy and more of their money on deep space exploration, going to those next amazing destinations like Mars or an asteroid. At the same time, the companies that partner with NASA have to invest in cost savings for those commercial endeavors that also benefit things like the spacesuit. So we figure out how to make things less expensive, and that helps us all get out into space sooner. Next slide. So with the technology challenges starting to be met, the cost challenges being met, and the technology is evolving, we're going to be able to get astronauts back into deep space fairly soon, certainly within all of our lifetimes. And I hope that these galleries and the presentations today start instilling some of that excitement in all of you, because for all I know, 10, 15 years down the line, you could be looking for jobs at NASA, at the aerospace companies that make all of this happen. So I hope that excitement catches in all of you a little bit today. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll start some question and answers, and some of those we'll be getting from our online viewers as well.
What is the most challenging part of preparing these objects for display?
I think Lisa will probably take that one on.
Do I stand? Thank you, Katie. The most challenging part of preparing an object for display is, as I said earlier, is making sure that the materials actually just don't change over time. So when you're handling the object and you're thinking about the environment that you're going to put it in the exhibition, you have to think about what's going to influence those materials over time, what kind of things would make them change, and then try to build an environment to keep them from changing. So we call that stabilizing the object. And we think about things like temperature, humidity, light levels, UV radiation, pollutants, and even people's handling the objects, which is why our objects are all in display cases in the museum, so nothing happens to that object for the entire time that it's on the display.
My name is Richard Baker. Doctor, what are you doing about solar radiation, cosmic radiation versus your spacesuits?
Part of what we're looking at as far as exposure to radiation, especially on Mars, where we have a belt of radiation around the Earth called the Van Allen belts that protect us from some of the cosmic rays and more dangerous radiation that we get bombarded with. That's not the case on Mars, that it doesn't have that same protection. Fortunately, on the surface of Mars, you have 50% protection just by standing on the ground. The planet itself protects the crew members from half of that radiation. Part of it will be looking at the total dosage of what they get exposed to and protecting them on the way there by surrounding their living capsules, perhaps with water or other protection. There's been some ideas about putting crew quarters underground, building up enough ground around them to protect them while they're not on EVA. Protecting them on EVA itself is going to be quite a challenge, and I'm not sure that the suits are going to provide the same level of protection as the crew modules themselves. There's the balance between the ability to do work and the weight that they carry. So it might be a matter of total exposure management.
And we have another online question. What material does lunar dust consist of?
Go ahead, Lisa. Lunar dust consists of a lot of different elements. There's actually a lot of iron in the dust. And even though it appears gray when you look at lunar pictures or you look at the pictures of the objects, up close is actually an orange-brown color. So it has a lot of iron in it, calcium, and a lot of glass silicon particles, which makes it very angular, and that's what makes it so abrasive to the materials when it's touching it.
I'm David Dvorkin, I'm curator here, and I'm always wondering how people get interested in this kind of subject. And I think this should apply to all three of you. When you were kids, what was it that, did you ever think that you would get involved in building spacesuits or displaying spacesuits? And I think for the kids in the audience, including myself, always be interesting to get a sense of how you got where you were, who you are, and maybe you can choose which one of you wants to start off with that.
Sure. How did I get to where I am? Well, I'm a curator here, which means that part of my job is taking care of artifacts and also researching them. I do a lot of history research. So I'm really a historian who gets to work with objects, which is a really cool thing to get to do. I was always interested in history as a kid. I thought it was really interesting, just learning about how people used to do things. But I also had a really strong interest in science fiction. When I was growing up, Star Wars was the really big thing, and so because I really enjoyed that, I ended up getting really lucky in that I could get inspired by some of those movies and things that I watched as a kid. And when I got to college, I got my degree in history, and I kind of kept going with things to the point of applying for a job here. And as I worked here, I worked on my PhD, and I get to be a real full-fledged curator. I get to go and hang out with people like Lisa and get to learn about the more of the science that we do here at the museum. I'm not a scientist myself, but I'm really interested in the work she does because it's different than what I do, and she gets to learn about objects in a different way. I learn about objects usually by looking at a lot of papers, which is what a lot of historians do. They look at documents, and Lisa, though, gets to investigate things with microscopes. So I work with her a lot and just seeing exactly how things are made, which is a really fun part of my job, getting to spend time in that with the objects. But also, we get to develop exhibits here as curators, which is part of what I've been doing for the last probably 6 or 7 years, I worked on this exhibit here, Moving Beyond Earth, and I also worked on the exhibit we'll go see. I was a curator for the Outside the Spacecraft exhibit. So you get to think about, how do we show our visitors, how do we get to show all of you the history of spaceflight? And that's one of my favorite parts, actually, is getting to think in terms of what a visitor would come to the museum and want to see. So it's kind of my path to getting to this point. And I'll hand it over to Greg.
Well, I have been interested in space for as long as I can remember, but there are a few things in particular when I was very young that I can recall. One, I remember reading a book about a boy who goes to a space station. It was a children's book, and I was very disappointed to find out after reading the book that kids couldn't go to the space station because there wasn't one. Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to help remedy that. I also built untold numbers of Lego spaceships, not unlike the one in the spaceship movie, Benny's spaceship, the little space guy. Well, I played with the original ones of them and made lots of them. I like the science fiction, Star Wars, Star Trek as well. But as I got older, I took some courses in high school that were engineering-based, construction-based, and I went from there into college into engineering. And I happened to have an alumni from my college who recruited me to UTC Aerospace, and have been enjoying my work ever since.
I was always interested in science as a child, but I will have to blame my mom for dragging me to museums my entire life and exposing me to all the history and culture out there. But I think really when I saw the Tutankhamun exhibit in the 1980s here at the National Gallery and saw the King Tut traveled here and the materials involved with that exhibit, that I really wanted to do archaeology. So I actually started in archaeology and went into science from there, because two parts of archaeology, you're really digging in the field or you're working in the laboratory doing science or in a museum. So I chose laboratories and science. But the main reason I love my job and went into conservation was because I get to touch everything in the museum. And I didn't like going to exhibits and not being able to touch anything. So unfortunately, you all can't touch everything in our displays. But there are a few of us that can, and I want to just make sure that everything that we do touch is available to you all for future generations to enjoy and to come see at the museum, and that nothing's happening to those objects.
We have another online question. Can astronauts eat inside their spacesuits?
That's actually a great question, something that we don't talk about in the Outside the Spacecraft exhibit, but astronauts, at least in recent years, have been given the option. Astronauts had shorter EVAs early on, but later on, astronauts were given the option of having basically some kind of food inside. It needed to be something that didn't turn into crumbs. That's true of foods in space generally, is that if you have, say, a piece of bread, it's very easy for those crumbs to just go floating away and cause a lot of damage. But there is something that's similar to a power bar is probably a good way to think about it, that they can have inside the spacesuit and they can snack on that. EVAs can last now up to 8 hours or so that sometimes they do need a little snack. They always have water available, but not all of them choose to eat because they have a lot of work to do out there, and sometimes they just like to get their jobs done and get back inside and then be able to have a real meal once they're back inside the spacecraft.
So we have a question in the audience.
Sure. I'm Laura. This is a question for Lisa. When you're doing conservation work on materials, is there any difference between older materials like, cotton and fibers and so forth, and the newer materials like Dacron and nylon and so forth like that?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Actually, older materials that are made of natural fibers like wood, cotton, linens, they actually survive better. A lot of the materials used in spacesuit production and you'll see in our display upstairs are about reaching their 50-year time period, and a lot of them are synthetic polymers, and the materials are not aging so well. So we're just learning about how to care for those, and I think because people thought they were modern and they were tough enough to go to the lunar surface or into space, that they would last forever. So I think we're just learning now about how to take care of those materials, what to do for them. We see different types of damages with them. and the chemical changes are not as great, but when they happen, they're very sudden and very quickly. So, hope that answered your question.
And we have another in-audience question. Do you want to say your name and ask your question?
Ataya, do you enjoy what you do?
Do you enjoy what you do?
I very much enjoy what I do. I've been here for almost 13 years. I like to tell people all the time I have the coolest job in the world because I get to see all this stuff every single day. I think some of my family members think that's a little boring now, but my kids really like coming here and hearing me talk about it because they haven't seen it before. And I like bringing all of that experience and all my excitement about my job to all of you. So yeah, it's fun every day. I work with a lot of really great people. I've made a lot of really good friends here. So coming to work every day is actually pretty fun. And I encourage all of you to find something you really care about. I think that's what makes it fun for me is I really care about what I do. I think it makes a difference. I think people learn things when they come here, and so it makes me enjoy my job more.
And we have another online question. What is the longest EVA that anyone has ever completed?
Do you know the longest?
It was over 8 hours.
It's over 8 hours. Yeah, I don't know the exact one. It's certainly been within the shuttle ISS period. Lasted over 8 hours. They usually because they're using a backpack system. They do have a limited supply of oxygen and things like that. So they are limited in how long they can be out there. But I'd have to check on the exact timing. But I'm sure it's over 8 hours.
And we have an in-house question. You're going to state your name and your question.
My name is Charles. And do y'all like to go in space one day?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
No,
No.
definitely.
The longer I've worked here, the less I've wanted to go into space.
Do you want to go into space? Yeah.
Hi, are all the space suits, are they custom made? Do each astronaut have their own, number one? And my second question was, I know there was problems with the space suit with water accumulating on a recent space station mission. Has that been resolved, or where does that stand?
That one, either of you could take that.
The spacesuits are semi-custom. The suits themselves come in different sizes, so they mix and match arm lengths, leg lengths, upper torso sizes to fit the particular crew members. Gloves, they try to find gloves that will fit the astronauts, but those, because they're where the work is being done, are often custom made. Those are they do laser scans of the hands to custom make those gloves. There are only around 12 backpacks for all the astronauts on the American side of the station, so they're semi-custom. As far as the water intrusion into the helmet during EVA, that has been resolved. They are performing American EVAs with the American suits again. As the suits continue their use, we do tend to see more issues come up over time. The suits have been in service for 30, 35 years. And part of the engineering challenge is how do we service those suits that are now up on station for great periods of time? So that's an engineering challenge. It's being met, and that particular challenge has been resolved.
Okay, we have another in-house question.
My name is Richard Hall. How does the engine start when a spaceship is about to launch into space?
So you're talking more about the the spacecraft. Well, with the space shuttle, you want to know how it launches itself? Well, there's on the space shuttle, you can see over on the model over here that it has different types of fuel. There's the two boosters at the side, the white rockets. Those are solid fuel, and so when those are ignited, those just keep burning, and that helps get it up into space. And then the big orange tank is a fuel tank, and that supplies fuel to the engines on the bottom of the space shuttle. So there are 3 engines at the bottom, and that helps lift it and get it the rest of the way into space. Now the spacecraft that are being used, that are launching astronauts, are all coming from Russia. And those are launched like traditional rockets that, that have a liquid fuel in them that launches. So you can actually, you can make little rockets on your own here, probably not nearly as powerful, but you have to just ignite it. And there's obviously a special way of igniting a rocket that big as opposed to one that you might light with a match. So it's a little bit more complex than that, but just to simplify it, they have to ignite the fuel, and that goes through a big system, and then that pushes the rocket off of the Earth.
My name is Jakari. Has anyone ever been stranded in space?
Stranded
No,
in space.
no, thankfully there's never been an experience like that. If you know of the movie Gravity, there was certainly a possibility of that in a movie setting, but no one's ever been stranded. One of the things that's really important when astronauts go out on spacewalks is that they have some way of getting back to their spacecraft. And so early on they used a tether. That umbilical cord would keep them attached to the spacecraft. The very first time an astronaut did it without a tether was in the 1980s. An astronaut named Bruce McCandless tested a backpack that was more like a jetpack, and he went away from the spaceship and then he came back, and when you come up on the tour of the exhibit, we'll see a picture of that. That's not often done. Usually there's a very thin metal wire, a tether still, that the astronauts stay attached to the spaceship with. But there are ways that they could get back. They do have something on their backpack that allows them in an emergency to kind of jet back a little bit. They're able to push their bodies back. It's called a safer. It helps them, the astronauts, if something were to happen to that tether, they would still be able to get back. And of course, there would always be a way, especially with the space shuttle, that they could kind of go and pick them up very carefully, of course. But nobody's ever been stranded, thankfully.
And that's all the time we have. I know that for the in-house audience, Jennifer and Lisa will be taking you on a tour upstairs if you're interested, so you can hang out.
Yeah, and I want to thank all of you for coming today. I want to thank all of our online viewers and our viewers on TV. And for those of you who are able to stay after for the tour, that's great. Also, thank you for to our sponsors, Boeing, for the What's New in Aerospace series. Thanks for coming this afternoon.